Let's take a step forward then in history. In your speech, Who Owns the World, that you held in the University of Massachusetts, you surfaced from internal documents a scheme known as the Grand Area. Could you talk about the Grand Area and specifically what role Germany was assigned within it?
This is scholarly work on the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department. The Council on Foreign Relations is the major non-governmental institution concerned with foreign affairs. It draws from a wide range of elite elements, business, politics, others, academic, and so on. It publishes the journal Foreign Affairs, which is the main establishment foreign affairs journal. From 1939 until 1945, the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department held regular planning sessions in which they tried to analyze the wartime situation and lay plans for the post-war economy. And they developed the concept which they called Grand Area. The Grand Area was defined as a region that the U.S. must control in the post-war era. It included, of course, the Western Hemisphere. It included the former British Empire, which the U.S. was intending to largely take over. Maybe Britain would be a junior partner. And as much of Europe, the commercial and industrial center of Europe, as much of that as possible, certainly Western Europe, its industrial, technological, commercial center. In the early stages of the war, it was assumed that there would be an American-controlled area, the Grand Area, and a German-controlled area. And they thought in the early stages of the war, it looked as if Germany would be successful in carving out an area. After Stalingrad, and at the time when the Russian forces were beginning to grind down the Germans, driving back toward Central Europe, the conception changed. They realized increasingly that Germany would not survive as a dominant force in the world, so the conception of the Grand Area extended beyond. This area was defined as one in which the United States would have pretty much complete economic and political control, and exercises of sovereignty by others which challenged this control would not be permitted. I can't give the exact wording right offhand, but it's something like that. You can easily find it. The major study of this was done by two young American political scientists, Larry Shoup and William Minter, in a book called Imperial Brain Trust. Larry Shoup, incidentally, has just come out with a new book studying Council on Foreign Relations programs in the later period. But that's the general conception. And it was pretty realistic. If you look at the power relations in the world, this was not an unrealistic picture. Remember that the United States emerged from the Second World War in a position of power that had no historical parallel. The U.S. had literally 50% of world wealth. It had incomparable security, controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans, had overwhelming military power and economic power. It was other industrial societies had been either seriously harmed or sometimes virtually destroyed by the war. The war was very beneficial to the U.S. economy. Industrial production virtually quadrupled. Wartime spending ended the Depression, which had not been ended before. Enormous stimulus to the economy. Technology was developed, which laid the basis for post-war growth. It was, in that context, Grand Area planning of the kind I described was by no means unrealistic. And furthermore, it was put into effect, it was implemented. If you look at the policies implemented and developed in the early post-war period, they followed these prescriptions pretty closely. Read, for example, the policy documents of the State Department policy planning staff, headed by George Kennan by then. They more or less spell out particular variants of these programs. Each region of the world was assigned what was called its function. So the function of Southeast Asia would be to provide raw materials and resources, not just for the United States, but primarily for the former colonial powers, which needed them in order to get dollars so that they could purchase the U.S. manufacturing surplus.
And Germany's function, Germany's particular?
Well, it took a couple of years, but within a few years, Germany began to be reconstituted as a central part of the Grand Area. It wasn't called Grand Area anymore. It was a part of the U.S.-dominated global system. By the early 1950s, there were steps towards rearm. Incidentally, part of this program, I should say, beginning actually in the 1943, 1944, was to undermine the anti-fascist resistance almost everywhere. At first in Italy, the first place where the U.S. and British forces penetrated. The Italian resistance had was holding down probably half a dozen German divisions, and in parts of Italy were beginning to reconstruct an independent society. All of this was dismantled as the U.S. and British forces moved through the peninsula, and they pretty much reinstated the traditional order, including fascist sympathizers. And similar programs were adopted in other parts of occupied Europe as the United States, Britain took over, including Germany. In fact, Kennan at one point, top post-war planner, said that the West ought to wall off, that's his phrase, wall off Western Germany from the Eastern Zone, because there was danger of the what they regarded as danger of the labor-based, what they called communist policies affecting the West, might affect them. In Italy, where there was a strong communist party, which was probably going to win the first 1948 election, the U.S. poured enormous resources into making sure that they wouldn't win the election, making it very clear to Italians in many ways that if they allowed the communists to take control, they'd be in deep trouble. One State Department official said the policies have to be clear enough so that the dumbest wop can understand. We're going to strangle them unless they vote the right way in the first free election. In Greece, at first the British moved in. They faced a strong, they tried to crush the anti-fascist resistance. They weren't able to do it. The Americans came in to join them, and there was a major war in which probably 150,000 Greeks were killed. The end result was a restoration of something like the traditional society, including fascist elements, and the tragedy of Greece goes on from there. Later in the 1960s, there was a real outright fascist coup in Greece, military fascist coup, strongly supported by the U.S., continued to support it until it was overthrown by the Greeks in the mid-70s.